Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our class today. This is a pruning of fruit trees and grapes today. My name is David Rice with Weber Basin Water Conservancy District, and I've got Hattie Ann Fassold with us today too. She's over our garden and education. She'll be joining us. In the background, she'll be answering a lot of questions. Let me just explain a little bit about the format. If you're new to this, you've never joined us today, this is a webinar, so you don't have to worry about being muted or speaking, and that presents a little bit of challenges for the engagement of the class. But what we'd like to do is, if you have questions, if you'll look on your little controls, you have a Q&A box. If you'll just type your question into that Q&A box, you also have a little raise your hand thing. Please don't use that because we won't be probably using that because we don't have that ability to go back and forth with unmuting and muting people and that background noise and chaos. So if you'll just use the Q&A box, type your question in. Hattie Ann will be in the background answering those questions as she can. If there's questions that are really good, general across the board to everybody, I'll pause occasionally and we'll address those questions specific to the slide, specific to the presentation. So hopefully this will be engaging. I've got some slides. I'm going to be showing you some things, talking about things, and then I have actually a couple small trees right here in my office today, and I'm going to show you on some new trees, and then I've pre-recorded some video of demonstration on pruning of some other fruit trees of different ages. So hopefully that'll be of benefit to you and that you'll be comfortable in knowing, best pruning practices and how to do this on your own. So with that, let me give you just a quick introduction. Those of you that maybe are not familiar with Weber Basin, I know many of you are. Just looking at the list of those signing up, we got people from all over the place, even out of the country. So thanks for joining us. We do appreciate that and are glad that we can reach a larger audience through this format. And I prefer the engagement of a live class, especially something with pruning where we can do a live demonstration and really show you what's happening. However, grateful to have you here. Weber Basin is the regional water provider for northern Utah, 4 counties, Davis, Weber, Morgan, and Summit counties, a population of about 700,000 people. And we provide drinking water on a wholesale basis, operating 3 large water treatment facilities, wholesaling that to cities. We provide irrigation water, agriculture water, industrial water. Many people locally are familiar with secondary water. Weber Basin water is a secondary, pressurized secondary water for irrigation on your landscapes. So the reason we do these classes is, of course, to help you as a homeowner, as a resident, to understand the landscape principles that will then help you manage a landscape and plants more effectively. And in doing that, you'll actually understand that more damage is done from overwatering than underwatering almost all the time. And so this class isn't specific to water necessarily, but it's a good practice. It's how to deal with some things in your landscape. Fruit trees, a great use of water for production. It's a crop. It's something you benefit from in your own yard, home orchards, and so forth. So we enjoy doing this. This is one of the fun classes. We encourage you to look at our website and look at the other classes coming up. And of course, there's going to be a lot of different things. We focus a lot on local scapes, how to make a landscape more water-wise, more maintenance-friendly, so forth. Look at all those and what's interesting to you. So I do want to mention this class, the slides will be available. We're recording the class, and so the recording will be available in addition to just the slides. So if you don't want to watch a whole recording, you could peruse the slides as fast as you wanted. They'll both be posted on our website following the class. It'll take a day or two, so don't look for this tonight or tomorrow. It'll be Monday at the earliest, because what we do is we have to have our IT guys go through and get that prepped and posted online. So it'll take a couple days for that, but certainly watch for the slides, watch for the video if you're interested. It's kind of a YouTube video, so you could come back and reference that later. So with that, let's just get started. I'm gonna switch over to the slide presentation. Again, if you have questions, use the Q&A box. I'll be going in and out of the slide presentation here just a little bit. And so anyway, bear with me as we go through this. I'll probably talk fast. I hope the volume level is fine. I hope everybody can hear. If you can't, let Hattie Ann know. and she can let me know. We'll try to adjust some settings and so forth, but for the most part, I think we're good. Let's get going. First off, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these resources. There are lots and lots of resources. We're not the only resource. We don't claim to be. We work closely with USU Extension on this. And so there's lots of resources through USU Extension that are great resources. And so we encourage you to look at those resources, go online. We can, of course, we can go into more details here, but here's some things, come back and reference this stuff later. All right, let's get into right into the pruning of this. Overall, why do you prune? A lot of people are thinking you prune to control a tree, to keep it small and all that stuff. That is not why you prune. If you want a small tree, buy a dwarf tree and it'll maintain its size and stay small on its own. But you're pruning to control tree health. I shouldn't say control, to manage tree health. You're removing dead and diseased and improving air movement. You're pruning to direct growth, not slow growth. And actually pruning stimulates growth. So you're just directing. If you know how to prune, you're going to direct the growth so you get the proper shape and structure. But pruning will not keep a tree small. I mean, it does. You bring a tree down. You can manage a tree size through pruning, but don't think pruning is going to keep a tree small. Pruning won't keep the tree small. It just shapes. And then you're going to create the best environment for fruit production. Now we're going to have a tree pruning on ornamentals here in a couple of weeks. Ornamentals are different simply because you're not worried about fruit production. So on a fruit tree, there are certain methods and different things that will help you get the best production, but also have a nice, attractive, and healthy tree by letting in light, knowing where the fruit grows, and of course, the management of harvest. So when do you prune? Dormant pruning is the rule, okay? Always remember, prune when it's dormant. Now, there is some light pruning that you can do as you see things growing in the summer. Water sprouts, I'll explain what some of these are. Water sprouts and different things. If there's a diseased branch, if you've got something going on, you can prune in the summer. You just don't want to do major pruning. Again, pruning stimulates growth. It does some different things. So you want to prune when a tree is dormant. So winter to early spring. So right now, actually, you've got the window, any month that doesn't end in R, okay, you can prune, except again, minimal pruning in those summer months. But you're talking September, October, November, December, no pruning on fruit trees, or very, very minimal for water sprouts and some of that. January, February, March, April, perfect months to prune. The challenge with those months is it's winter, and most people don't enjoy getting out when it's freezing outside and pruning. So you're looking for a window of opportunity. The tree is dormant, it's spring, but the temperatures are manageable for you. The tree's not gonna care. You can prune it in January, it's fine. You're gonna care because you're out there freezing to death. So for flowering shrubs, this is not related to fruit, but for flowering shrubs, prune them before June 1st after they blossom. And I just throw that in there because some people are like, well, you told me not to prune until they were dormant. If you prune those early flowering shrubs when they're dormant, you're going to prune off all the blossoms. So you wait till right after they flower and then you prune those. That was just a little side note. So you can prune anytime the dead, diseased, or dumb branches. Again, this will just save, if you see something in the summer that's dying, prune it off. You don't need to wait 6 months till that thing is having issues and 6 more months of growth or whatever to prune it off. Certainly cut off the weird little things, okay? This is hanging, crossing, rubbing branches, the water sprouts that I'm going to show you, suckers from the bottom of a tree. Summer pruning can increase disease risk because you simply have those more active pathogens, different fungi, different bacterial things that, of course, are more active and better able to grow and accelerate their growth in the warmer months. All right, so, excuse me, pruning doesn't stop growth, as I mentioned earlier, it only directs growth. So this little picture kind of shows this, but not completely, but I'm gonna show you on some actual sticks that I've got here, what this means. So bear with me as I go through some slides, and then I'll pause and we'll kind of review some things with some actual twigs and go over that. So this is what I mean by directing growth. Now, granted, look at these pictures. None of them are really fruit trees. Looks like there's one that's kind of a flowering tree there with a little table thing in the middle. But notice you can direct growth. If you get a tree young enough, you can bend branches, you can kind of manipulate things and control growth doing it early. Once a branch is large, you can't do so much with it. But pruning and bending helps direct growth. And I'll talk about a couple other things here with directing. But if you cut a branch, it's not going to stop that branch from growing. It simply changes the direction of how that branch will grow, depending on where the buds are, depending on some other factors. So think of always pruning as directing growth, not controlling growth. I mean, in a way you're controlling, but you're directing. All right, so here's where we're going to start showing you some stuff, basic tree stuff with some terminology. If you kind of look at that diagram, you've got a leader, which is kind of always, most often it's referred to as a central leader. If it's the main branch going up through the middle of a tree, it's just the leader, and it has terminal buds. And I'll talk a little bit more about terminal buds and what those do and how they control overall tree growth. There's some interesting things with tree hormones and different things that when you remove those terminal ends, different things happen to the tree and it allows it to grow in different ways. But for now, you've got the leader, and scaffolds refer to the layers of branches that are coming off of the main trunk going outward. So you've got scaffolding branches going out the sides. I'll show you some pictures of these to try to illustrate the point. And again, on the small tree that I've got inside here. Water sprouts are those very aggressive growth that usually come off of a scaffold branch or off of the main central leader, and they grow just usually straight up. They're very smooth branches. They don't have much to them, and they're just growing straight up. A lot of times water sprouts can get 3 to 4 or 5 feet long if it's a younger aggressive tree. Sometimes they'll just be more like a foot to 18 inches tall or long. And you can remove those. They will eventually turn into wood and fruiting wood and everything else, but it just clutters up the middle of a fruit tree. Suckers are the things that come off of the crown or the roots, root suckers or crown suckers. A lot of times suckers come because a lot of the fruit trees have been grafted. So they've been grafted onto an aggressive root stock with a certain type of, whatever variety of tree you have. And the roots want to grow a lot. And so if they're very, very vigorous, but the tree itself isn't as vigorous, sometimes that root, the crown where the graft occurs, it'll just send up a lot of growth, which comes out at the base of the tree, and those are suckers. You cut all those off. You don't want to spray those ever, because you'll kill your tree. You'll have to cut them, and you just continue to cut them over and over and over. And then spurs are where fruit is formed. That's really, really important, and I'll show you those as we get going. Okay. So here's kind of some pictures of what we're just talked about. The water sprouts, notice they're coming, the branches that are very vertical, straight up, those are water sprouts off of those main trunks. Very smooth, straight up branches. Suckers, that picture to the right, just right at the base of the tree. And then just a little illustration about rubbing branches, crossing branches. Anytime you have things that are crossing or rubbing or just crowding, those are things that you're going to be looking to prune out, okay? Now, those of you that have aggressive crab apples or apples and you just got these lots of suckers, there is not really a good way to stop those from growing. Again, it's because of grafting and aggressive rootstocks. There's not much you can do with that other than you just continue to keep cutting them. Over time, that tree will slow down a little bit as it matures and everything. The vigor of those growths will slow, but they're not ever going to probably stop. So you just have to keep cutting them. You can cut them a little bit below the ground. You can try to go all the way down to the root that they're on and cut them off. Dig around a little bit, but there's nothing you can really do to stop those. There's some stuff. If you go to nurseries, there's things that claim to stop sucker growth and slow it, and most of those are hormone based, and they may slow it down. They may work. I don't have any experience with any of those really working, but you may find something, and someone out there may say, "Oh yeah, I've done it and it works great." Just generally, no, those are hard to control because of just the nature of grafting and rootstocks. So moving on, apical dominance. So I talked about that central leader. Now the little illustration here is more like an evergreen, a conical evergreen. And this is a little bit of technical stuff, but I want you to understand what's happening when you prune off the tip or a leader of a tree. You have auxin, which is a growth regulator hormone in a plant. Auxins create apical dominance, which is why you get a conical shape to an evergreen tree. Is because the very tip actually has, that's where most of the auxin is being produced in a tree, and it's sending it down through the tree. But the further it gets away from that apical, that dominant leader, the less auxin there is, and so more growth is allowed to happen. So that's why the bottom of the tree is wider, the top of the tree is narrower, because the auxin, that central leader and the terminal bud is actually suppressing the lateral growth. So if you apply that to a fruit tree, you have a central leader. If you cut off the central leader, what that essentially does is it frees the other parts of the tree. You reduce the auxin being produced, and lots of lateral growth happens. It starts to grow out wider at the base and at the top, instead of more apical dominance, where you get more upward growth. Well, the growth is upward and it's suppressing some of the lateral growth below it. I hope that came out clear. There's lots of stuff that happens with trees. So as you prune, if you realize what's happening with these hormones and growth regulators that happen naturally in a plant, you'll better understand how you're directing the growth as you make cuts. And so you make a cut and next year, like, what happened? Why is this growing so crazy? You'll know you removed the terminal bud, which basically freed up the others to go crazy and grow. Now, pruning is an art and a science. This picture here shows an apple tree that's been really heavily pruned, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but understanding what I just talked about, if you do very aggressive cutting like this, it's going to stimulate lots of new growth. And I've got, in my little video at the end here, I've got an example where I did this exact thing to a pear tree. And the owner wanted it done to bring it back down. It was out of control. It was crazy. But understanding there's going to be lots of new vigorous water sprouts and new growth that happens because all the terminal buds are removed. So it's just going to shoot out growth everywhere. And in doing that, you're going to have to continue to shape. That's why it's the art, is understanding the science of it, but then understanding also trees, you can direct them and form them in lots of shapes. And you know, for beauty, for fruit production, I've seen some really, really ugly trees that are great producers. And then of course, in your landscape, you probably want an attractive tree as well as a producer. So it's you tie the art with the science. So these are questions you should be asking yourself when you prune: is what plant is it? What am I working with here? How big do I want it to get? Now, remember, I just said earlier, you're not pruning to control, you're not pruning to shrink a tree, to always keep it small. You're pruning to direct it. So you can keep it a certain size if you understand how you need to cut it every year to keep it to that size. And now, one tip I'll say here too is, if you want a small tree and you don't want to have to fight it every year to keep it small, buy a dwarf or a semi-dwarf fruit tree. They'll naturally just stay smaller. You won't have, they're not nearly as vigorous, and you're not going to have to, you know, you're not, if you want a 15-foot tree and you get a standard apple tree, well, those things can get 30 feet tall. And then you're fighting that. You're just fighting the vigor of the tree to keep it to a size you want. So look for dwarf and semi-dwarf varieties that'll help you with that. So how does the tree grow? These are, again, questions you're asking. How does it grow? How does it produce fruit? Where is the fruit formed? And what function is it in my yard? Once again, if you have a tree that you want both as a landscape tree, but also a producer, then you're going to do things a little bit differently to shape it, as well as remembering where the fruit spurs are, so you can have fruit as well. You can do both things, and I'll show you that demonstration. So let's talk about some tools. Tools that, number one is your hands, of course. You can use your hands to pinch out water sprouts. You don't have to let these things grow and wait to prune them all out. Water sprouts, you can see them coming in the summer and the spring. And when they're just little tender things, you know, 2 inches tall, 2 inches growing, they're green, they're fresh, you can just break those off with your fingers. If you do that, you don't have to worry about pruning them out later when they're 12 inches tall or 14 inches tall and a little more woody-like tissue instead of just green and tender and easy to break out. You've got hand pruners. You've got your 2-inch type hand saw for larger branches. You've got loppers that are useful for larger branches, up to 1 inch, maybe 1.5 inch type branches, depending on the type of branch and what it is. And then a chainsaw for fruit production. Funny enough, if you need a chainsaw, you've waited too long. And funny enough, in the little video at the end, I'm going to show you on that mature pear tree, I used a little electric chainsaw, because if the branches become 3 or 4 inches in diameter, it just takes you a lot of time to cut through those with a little hand saw. It can be done, and a lot of people prefer to do that. But if you want to make your job a little quicker, you may need some sort of a little bit of a power saw. Okay. So, sorry, I got to keep moving on here. Now, this picture has nothing to do with fruit trees, but this is an example of, if you need a lift and a chainsaw for your trees, you've waited way too long. And, if that's the case and that's where you're starting because you've moved into a place, I'll show you at the very end. You can go ahead and get the lift and the chainsaw and the ladders and cut it way, way down and then try to manage it from there. But if you have a younger tree, don't let it get to this point. You shouldn't need to get to this point. You wouldn't need the power equipment to deal with those trees. So, all right, what to cut? Now let's start getting into these basics here. What to cut? Always remove dead, diseased, and dumb branches. So that's what you always look for first, all right? And there's always the depends rule on what to cut. Type of fruit tree, age of the tree, those are always things. Now, I'm telling you principles, but there is no perfect way to do this. Everybody has a little bit of their own style for how they prune, and you'll find your style, but removing dead, diseased, or dumb. Dumb means branches that hang down, branches are crossing, branches going where you don't want them to go. Those things, of course, are the easy ones. After that, then it's just applying correct cuts and shaping the tree how you want it shaped. Okay, so the first 3 to 4 years of any tree, you're basically focusing on training and structure. If you buy that little tree at the nursery, and sometimes you'll even buy them and they have blossoms on them, and you're thinking, oh, great, I'm going to plant this thing and I'm actually going to get fruit this year. You can do that. Most of the time I tell people, pluck off those blossoms that first year. Don't worry about getting any fruit. I know you're going to miss it, but get the tree established. Let it spend its energy establishing and rooting in well, and start the pruning that first year if you can. If you buy it a little late and it's summer, you can wait and do that pruning that first winter, but start the training and the structure of that tree when it's small and new. And then after that first 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the tree, then you're going to have a nice structured tree, and then you can focus on fruit production, fruit size, the control of the tree, proper direction of growth, and you'll just be well set up to make your pruning easier going forward from that point on. If you miss the first 3 or 4 years and then you decide to start pruning at 5 years, the tree usually has already developed some structure that you may not want there, but then at that point it's really hard to bring it back in. You're removing large branches. It's really hard to start shaping it and directing it as you should or could if you would have started earlier. Now, here's an example of two things. One is it's probably wasn't pruned correctly from the beginning, so the structure of the branches, the joint structures aren't strong enough, and then of course it's just overloaded. There was too much outside. They may have even started out being pruned correctly with a nice open vase, but then it wasn't pruned and controlled a little bit at the top, and so it got too heavy. And you see this all the time. People are always propping their branches up. And thinning is another thing. If you want good large fruit, but not just tons of it, you should thin to reduce some of the weight load, but you'll also get really nice big fruit. And I'll talk a little bit more about thinning coming up, but thinning is really important. Remember one principle about thinning: the tree wants to make seeds. So the trees don't think, but their natural thing is to reproduce themselves. They want to make seeds. The size of the seed usually will not change much. but what encapsulates the seed is what may change. If you have 300 seeds on the tree, they all may have some material around them, the fruit around them. But if you only have 40 or 50 or 60 seeds, they're going to have more material around. The tree is expending energy to make sure those seeds are successful. The fruit is just encapsulating that seed. So thinning, think of it this way, thinning, you're going to get more fruit and less seeds. If you don't, then you're going to still get fruit, but you actually end up with more seeds, per weight. So anyway, just a little side note. Here's an apple tree, of course, overloaded, never pruned. This is what you want to avoid. If you start pruning correctly from the beginning, you'll avoid this kind of stuff. You'll avoid a mess. You'll avoid breaking branches, just really overwhelming messes. So here's a little picture of a tree. It looks like it hasn't, you can see it was pruned kind of in the middle. There's been some stuff done on this, but structurally it's not that great. Branches going everywhere. You got to make decisions. This tree could certainly be pruned, and there could be some things done to it to start shaping it. This looks like an apple tree, possibly a pear, but apple or pear. But if you have a tree that you simply think it is too far gone, or it's in the way, or structurally it's just terrible, you can just make a decision and prune it once. One cut method. Now I know it's I guess a way trying to be a little bit funny. It's not that funny, but that is one thing you can do. You can make one cut, the tree is solved, and then you buy a new tree and you start over. If it's already growing, fairly mature, you've got a lot of production on it, usually this isn't the option. You want to deal with that tree, you want to prune it, you want to shape it, and you can do some aggressive pruning, just realizing you've got aggressive growth the next year, and then you'll shape it from there. So anyway, just be thinking about some of those things. So really quick, maybe before, I think Hattie Ann is answering some questions. I'll just let her continue to answer those, and I'll pause. I'll pause again here shortly, and if there's questions we still need to address that can't be addressed, I'll do those. So let's talk about some guiding principles about where the fruit is produced. So far, I've talked about some basics of the tree. We've talked about some different issues. Now let's talk about where the fruit is produced, because that's the thing you most want to know. You don't want to be pruning off everything that's going to produce fruit. So in apples and pears, you need to know that it'll produce fruit on 2-year-old spurs or older. Now notice the picture to the right. That is a picture of fruiting spurs. They're a little bit shorter. They sometimes have a little bit of a whorl look to them. They don't grow very fast. Spurs grow slowly over time. And so you'll start to notice those over time. Don't prune off the spurs. They're the fruit producers. And you'll see those on apples and pears. So on peaches, they produce fruit on 1-year-old wood or older. And so peaches honestly are very prolific. You can prune a lot of stuff off a peach tree, and they have blossoms. They put out 3 blossoms on each little bud, and there's lots of them, and they'll produce some on the main stems. 3-year-old or older wood, or excuse me, 1-year-old or older wood. And then apricots and plums, 1-year-old or older wood and older spurs. They have spurs and non-spurred blossoms, but plums and apricots, they kind of produce fruit everywhere. So you're actually worried less when you prune those about pruning everything off, because they'll just produce fruit everywhere. And cherries produce fruit on 2-year-old wood or older spurs. So kind of knowing that may help guide you a little bit on when and what you're pruning, okay? Now let's talk about pears and apples here for just a minute. Notice the pictures to the right, the small pictures. Those are fruiting spurs. Now leaf buds look kind of similar, but you'll start to be able to differentiate between leaf buds and fruiting spurs as you go along. And granted, once you have a big mature tree, when you're pruning, you'll probably remove some of the spurs just because you're cutting some in. You may accidentally break some of them off as you get inside the tree a little bit. Don't worry about that, because it's a big mature tree. You still got hundreds of them, but spurs take a little bit of time to grow. It's 2 years or so before you're going to have fruiting spurs and that are going to keep producing. So fruit on spurs that are 2 to 5 years old. So when you plant a new apple tree, just expect to wait a few years to have fruit. And like I mentioned, the first couple of years, you maybe want to even just pluck the fruit off if you see any forming, just to give the tree time to mature and establish well. The buds differentiate in mid-June on apples and pears. And then, of course, you need to thin the fruit, and so that you're not overloading branches, causing them to bend, just overloading the tree. Now, if you have a mature tree and you're getting apples every other year, usually that's pruning and thinning that would help resolve that. What happens is the tree overdoes one year, it's not thin, and it produces just tons and tons of fruit. It produces fruit everywhere. It's covered, it's loaded. And in essence, it kind of burns itself out. It wears itself out producing all those seeds. And then the next year, it'll be a very light year. So to get that back into balance, you thin, you reduce some of the load and some of the energy expenditure of that tree so that it's not just going crazy one year and trying to recover the next. It'll get it back into an every year cycle if you're thinning properly and pruning properly. So here's a picture of a fruit bud and a leaf bud. Now, you kind of think, well, they're not that much different. The fruit buds are usually a little bit more rounded and a little bit more swollen, a little fatter than the leaf buds. Leaf buds are usually a little more narrow, a little more pointed. And as you get into a tree a little bit, you'll start to notice the difference between the fruit bud and the leaf bud. It's not always easy though. And sometimes there's a leaf bud right near a fruit bud, and don't be surprised if sometimes you'll have a fruit bud that's just poking out of another branch that has a leaf bud on it, and they're close together. So you'll start to notice these and be able to differentiate the two. Really quick, let me just check the questions here. Let's see, Hattie Ann's still typing some of these. I'll actually still come back to some of these. Some of these are good questions. She's going to continue to answer some of these, and whatever she can answer, we'll get back to them. Peaches and nectarines. They fruit on one-year-old wood, like I mentioned. 3 mixed buds, like that picture shows, and they require heavy annual pruning. You can remove up to about 50% of the total tree every year without doing too much harm, and because they just producers. They produce a lot, and if you don't thin them or excuse me, don't prune them enough, you'll probably have overloaded branches and you may end up splitting your tree. Now, if you have a mature tree that got too heavy one year and split, and it's like a branch that's maybe not all the way broken off, but it's cracked, it's tough to deal with that. Those things will usually never heal completely back together. Some people have tried to wrap those up and tie them up together. And sometimes some of the tissues will grow back together a little bit over time, but usually they don't. And so what's happened is there's always going to be a weak spot there. There's always going to be a problem there. It's a potential source for infections, bacteria and things. So depending, you can probably cut that big branch off and then just start to work with the rest of the tree. It'll be a little lopsided. It'll probably have a funny look to it. But if you have a branch on a peach or nectarine that's split out, you're never really going to be able to recover that fully. So it's best probably to prune it off, cut it, give it a clean cut, get that off of there, and then just start dealing with the rest of your tree. If it's really just destroyed your tree, I would suggest cutting that off, planting a new tree. While it's growing, you're dealing with the old tree, and then once the new one is mature enough, cut the old one down. Peaches and nectarines also have a fairly short life relative to many other trees. Their productive life is really somewhere around the 10 to 12 year mark. After that, they'll start declining and dying. So if you have an older peach or nectarine tree and it's starting to die, you see bigger branches dying out every year, just know that you've reached the life capacity of this tree, and it'll slowly keep declining until eventually the whole thing dies. And I've seen trees, peach and nectarine trees, productive for 15 years, but then they just go down. So just be aware of that. Apple trees can live for a very long time. Apricots, a lot of those others live for a very long time. 50-year-old trees, still productive. Peaches and nectarines are not like that. So let's keep going. Apricots, cherries, and plums. And notice these pictures. where they have fruit. Notice there's fruiting blossoms everywhere. And if you have one of these trees, you'll notice there's blossoms all up and down the stems. There's blossoms at the ends. You know, there are blossoms everywhere. So when you're pruning, you're just not concerned so much about cutting off buds and cutting off the spurs or anything like that. Go ahead and prune it, shape it, get the crossing branches and everything else out of the way, get it nice and structured and shaped how you like, and you'll get fruit and it'll be productive, and you'll just enjoy the tree. So it's continuing with guiding principles. Something so important is let the light in. Fruit, actually, for good production, you want light. Now, sometimes we don't think about this. Of course, the tree is out in the sun, it's getting light, but to have the structure of a fruit tree a little more open and have light get in there, you'll actually have a better color, better flavor, and better yield, because of the light is needed for flower and bud formation, and just an overall production of the tree fruit. You'll do better if it's a little bit more open. Now, that's not the case with a shade tree, right? With a shade tree, you kind of want dense and thick and nice thick shade. If you want both, you've got to, weigh that out. What's the balance? Do I want more shade? Do I want more fruit? Now, granted, you'll still have shade. If it's a big apple tree, you want it nice and open for some light to go through, but you'll still have plenty of shade underneath it. But it'll help air movement, light movement, everything through the tree if you'll kind of open that up and remember that you need a little more open structure. Dense, very thick fruit trees are just not going to be as productive or yield as much. So tree shape is very important to create light pathways. Notice the little illustration there is you've got what's referred to as scaffolding layers. You kind of have a layer at the bottom, another one in the middle, another one at the top. Now, granted, on very, very big mature trees and how they're shaped, you may have 5 tiers of scaffolds, or it may have been cut out and you have more of a vase shape to that tree, which I'll talk about in just a second. But structure and how that tree is opened up is really important. Branch angle is also very important. Ideal branch angle is 30 to 45 degrees. The wider crotch angles support heavier loads. Now, sometimes that doesn't seem logical. You think, well, if that's opened up wider, the branches get heavy, maybe it'll split. But actually, the more narrow branches are the weaker structured. More narrow joint angles are actually weaker angles than a wider angle. And so if you can get a little wider angle on those, you'll have a better strength and to support heavier loads. And then the vertical growth is usually vegetative growth. And so it's easy to see that and cut that out of there as well. Horizontal growth is usually fruitful growth, is kind of a general rule. And so let me help you understand this if you have small trees. Now, these pictures, there's a lot of pictures going on here. There's a lot of stuff on young trees to try to get that a little more open, because you've all probably seen young trees and all the branches are in there tight and close together and they're all going upwards, especially on pears and apples. Use branch spreaders or clothespins, different things. Now, the picture of the clothespins, notice the clothespin is right above a little branch. They've put a clothespin on the main stem, and the little branch underneath it, that clothespin is simply holding that branch down so it grows outward instead of upward. Now, you can do that on very small branches. If the branches are already kind of large, you can use what they call branch spreaders. And this is for young trees. Big mature trees that are already structured, you can't do much about those. But when they're young, you can train them and get those branches growing outward horizontally instead of vertically. You can make your own. The pictures here, there's some wood ones that have just been cut out of some mold boards or something, cut a little notch in them. They stuck in there to spread the branches out. You can actually buy branch spreaders of different sizes made out of plastic, different things. So getting the horizontal growth outward is important to structure, and then you'll have so much less of a fight later on with proper branch structure, with the shape, with the openness of a tree. So that's an idea for you. Let's talk about some pruning cuts then. There's only 2 basic pruning cuts. There's what's referred to as a heading cut and what's referred to as a thinning cut. So heading cuts are simply shortening the branch or the shoot. You're cutting it down somewhere in the middle and you're just shortening it. It encourages lateral growth. So if you do a heading cut, it's going to encourage growth below it. and it's heading cuts are done in hedges. You hedge something off and it makes a nice thick hedge. Thinning cuts, you remove the entire branch or shoot back to the lateral trunk, the lateral branch, and thinning cuts actually direct the growth a little better than heading cuts. Heading cuts just happen and you just get lots of lateral growth in all kinds of places. So here's an example of some that have been headed. When you head a tree, notice the big stumps in there that have been headed, and then all the vigorous growth that's up around those, right? It just stimulates lots of lateral growth. So if you head your fruit trees, just expect you'll have lots of growth up around the area where that has been headed. So here's a couple trees that, of course, they've headed cuts, keeping a tree small, fruit trees, apple trees. There's lots of upward growth on those trees. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. You can continue to keep that low and continue to do heading cuts, but eventually you do have some knobby ends and different things, but the tree can still be productive and everything. It's just a different way, different things you're dealing with when you do heading cuts. So here's some just illustrations of this. Basic pruning cuts. You got picture on the left, illustration. Headed cuts, you're cutting just across the branches. Thinning cuts down to the end of a branch. So before we move on here, let me do this. I want to show you, let me just show you a couple things. So I got a couple little branches here just to illustrate this point. Now, a couple things here maybe that'll help you out is, I'll back up a little bit. This is basically a water sprout. And notice, this is really smooth growth. This was cut out of a flowering almond, actually. It's an almond tree, but it's no different than an apple or anything else. Notice it's just very smooth wood. There are little buds. You've got little buds all up and down this branch. But this is essentially a water sprout. This one happens to be about 3.5 feet long. But let's just, to illustrate a point here, if you have a branch like this, a heading cut is simply cutting across the branch. You've headed that branch. That's a heading cut. Now, if this branch is still attached to a tree, what this heading cut does is it's removed the apical dominance, the terminal bud. So now all these little buds along here, these are some of them are latent buds. They're not actually going to grow. But as soon as you remove that, now it's freed up all of those to grow. So you'll expect lots of these buds to start shooting forth growth, and it can happen all the way down. So if this is a brand new little tree referred to as a whip, if you head it, now you start to get lateral branching. And that's what you do on a brand new little tree, because brand new little trees are a whip. And then that's what they'll do in the nursery. They'll take this 1-year-old whip and they'll head it off, and it starts growing out branches, and then they'll kind of shape it and prune it from there. But if knowing that on a tree, any of your branches up in the tree, if you just head them off, you're going to start getting lots of growth down here. Whereas the alternative is if you've got already some lateral branching, but you don't want some of these branchings, or a way to control the growth is instead of just heading, instead of just tipping all these heads off right here, all these, you take it down here to this branch joint and you cut it here. Now that's a thinning cut. What's happened now is you still have some control over the growth. So this thinning cut actually directs growth better. Now, instead of all kinds of lateral growth, there's still some suppression of growth. Now one of these others becomes more of a central leader, and you can start to direct growth. So if you wanted growth going this, this direction, following this branch, you kind of steer that away. You steer it that way, and you can cut everything away to steer growth that direction. Now growth continues out this way. So as you want a tree to continue to grow outward, you can do thinning cuts down to the branches and train this tree to grow outward simply by doing thinning cuts and leaving the branches that are going the direction you want them. So I hope that kind of helps you with what I've just described with thinning cuts, with heading cuts on just these little sticks. Now, granted, if everything is just too tall, you can, now if this was your branch and it's just like, well, that's way up there, thinning cuts aren't going to bring it down as much as I want. Well, then come down and you look for a bud going the right direction, because there's buds all on here. So you look for a bud that's headed the direction you want it to go. This bud is going out this direction. This bud over here is going out this direction. So if you want growth to go this way, cut right above the bud. Now it's still a heading cut, but this branch here is going to go the direction this way. And then next year you can leave that one going and prune off a lot of the other lateral growth that happens. So let's go back to the presentation here. All right. So let me check out the questions here. Actually, let's just, no, I'll just keep going. I'll get to these questions after I'm done with the presentation, because then it doesn't, I'll probably get to some of those answers, or Hattie Ann can keep typing in answers as we go. All right, so training systems of a tree. Let's talk about these. Now these are not hard fixed rules. Okay, you can train and have whatever kind of form of a tree you like, but these are some typical training systems for various trees that you see for maximum production. That orchards will do this. This is that kind of training structure. Okay, so an open vase structure would be used for peaches, apricots, nectarines, Japanese plums, and sour cherries. Now, I have a sour cherry at home that I am growing, and I've left it as a central leader, just a central leader tree. So you can do either. Some of it depends on what you want the tree to look like. But typical structure is open vase for those that I've just mentioned. So what that means is you're selecting 3 to 4 primary scaffold branches that are going out from the tree in the directions you want. Now you can choose, you're kind of thinking about how far above the ground I want. 18 to 24 inches, maybe you want it 36 inches above the ground is where you want things to start. And eventually a distributed whorl. In other words, you've got branches coming out in all directions. 6 to 8 inches apart vertically. Okay, you remove any growth 1 foot from the trunk. So this is kind of what, here, let me go back a little bit. No, this is good. So notice this is kind of developing the structure from a young tree. Now, some of you have older trees and you may not be able to do this, or maybe you still can, or maybe it doesn't matter. But I'm telling you just some basic structures. If you're starting new trees, this is a good way to start them out. So notice the top diagram there. Before pruning, after pruning, the first summer, dormant pruning, you know, how you structurally, you remove the center leader and it starts to direct growth outward like a vase. That's why they call it an open vase. The top view there is showing simply, you know, this one only has 3, but you could have 4 or 5 branches coming out in different directions to give you this distribution of scaffolds. Now, ideally, they're slightly off from each other on the main trunk. One's a little bit above the other. You don't want necessarily all the scaffolds coming out at one central point, because that could create a weakness and break them. But if they're off a little bit, a couple inches up and down, coming off that main trunk, you'd be very successful and have a very structured, strong tree that's a vase shape. Okay, so here's how you develop that open center. Nursery stock kind of looks typically like this. You got one main central leader, you got a few little branches. Notice the blue line, you decide where you want the branches up, you cut it off. And I'm going to demonstrate this on a young tree here in just a minute to kind of give you a better feel for what this is. Excuse me, I had to get a drink here quick. So after a couple of years, it starts to look like this. The lateral growth is getting longer, getting stronger. Notice that the branches haven't all come out at the same point on that main trunk. And over time, after they get a certain length, now this says 4 feet. It doesn't have to be 4 feet, but you know, these will start to grow and you'll start to get more lateral branching off of those. And so you're continually shaping. It's going to get taller, it's going to get wider, and eventually you're going to have a very structured tree. Here's an example in real life. Notice the open shape of it, lots of growth. This is before it's pruned, and then this is after it's pruned. Notice the structure remains intact. You're keeping it wide, you're keeping it open. Now this was a peach or a nectarine, I'm not sure which, but notice again, there's quite a bit of growth. There's kind of a lot of stuff in the middle, and that's like, wow, you know, you might be shocked thinking, well, that's a lot of stuff to come off of there. Well, in peaches and nectarines, you can do that. You're still actually going to get fruit on this tree. And it still keeps a nice structure. You're directing growth outward. You're still keeping the tree to the size you want by kind of tipping and terminating some of the buds on top. or the lateral, excuse me, the vertical growth. And so you end up with a very nice structured tree. Now here's examples of an orchard, a peach, or these are probably peaches in an orchard. Notice again, these are mature trees. So these have been around a while, but notice they have been trained to a nice open shape. Now look at all that growth on top. That's mostly new growth. Every year they're going to be vigorous. They're going to send off a couple feet of growth, 2 to 3 feet, maybe more. And then notice afterwards, a lot of branches come out, but the structure is there. So it's strong, it's supporting a lot of load. If now you don't have to do this because this is an orchard, so that's what they're doing. Their livelihood is based on production. But to me, this tree also looks good. In the summer, these trees look really good. Of course, they're shorter, but they'll fill in. They have leaves and it gets filled and they have a really nice look to them. But if you don't want that open of a vase, you can direct growth and get the shape you want. So it's both an ornamental and a fruit tree for your yard. But if you're really just concerned about production, well, then try to do what the orchards do. Go around, look at some of these orchards and kind of see how they're structured and what they're doing. And you can tailor and kind of design your tree like that. Now, if you've got a mature tree that hasn't been pruned like this, work with it. It's okay. It's still producing. Again, it's knowing where it's producing fruit and then managing and growth from there. If you already have a central leader, you don't have to worry about cutting that thing out. If this is an 8-year-old tree, don't do that. You can just work with the structure you have and then just manage it from there. So now let's talk about the central leader. Typically, this is for apples, European plums, sour cherries, and pears. Excuse me, sweet cherries and pears.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
There are just some questions that I think would be good for you to answer live.
Okay, we'll pause here for a second then before we get on to central leader, and we'll just go through these. Okay, I'll just read up some of these questions because I don't think any of the attendees can see the questions, so I'll just read it out loud and then I'll answer it. So it's, I harvested 124-year-old apple. I harvested a 124-year-old apple tree last year and it was still prolific and the fruits tasted amazing. Can apple trees live for that long or is it rare? Yes, apple trees can live a very long time. 124-year-old, that's probably as long as I've ever heard. But apple trees can certainly live 100+ years. You know, they can, especially some of the older ones. I think the newer cultivations may not live that long. But you've got good old-fashioned standard apple trees. They're large. They can be well established, and they can live a very long time. They're big, healthy trees. If you've got a big tree like that, you know, be careful with it. You don't want to totally cut that thing to pieces and reduce its life. But they can still be managed. They can still be pruned to keep a new vigor, new growth happening. You can bring them down to size a little bit, but that's a great question. They can live that long. It's probably a little rare. I don't know that I've heard of any being that long, but certainly it's a great question. Another one was, what are the best kind of plum trees to plant in Layton? That's personal preference. Any of the plum trees, I mean, all kinds of plum trees will grow here along the Wasatch Front in Davis County, Layton primarily. So you can grow just whatever plum you love to eat. If it's the bigger sweet plums, the smaller tart plums that are used kind of for jellies and different things. I would look around at the nurseries and see what's available. If you don't like any of those varieties that are available, you can mail order a tree. You can get it bare root, you can get it otherwise, and you can get any kind of plum. When looking for plums, some of them are self-fruitful, meaning they'll pollinate themselves. Others need a pollinator. So that's the only thing I would advise you to do is just look into the pollination of that and make sure you get one that's self-fruitful unless you want two. And if you want two, you could get two different varieties that maybe pollinate each other. But otherwise, just choose the kind of plum you love, honestly. I don't think I want to throw out recommendations for specific ones. And honestly, I haven't grown all kinds of plums. I grow personally some prune plums and we've grown some the little tart plums just for jelly. I don't have a lot of experience growing the bigger, nicer, sweeter plums. So choose a variety you like or ask around some other people that have grown some plums. If you know somebody that's grown some, certainly ask them. and get some ideas there. But nurseries typically have a pretty good variety locally here that you could use. One is, how long do you leave a branch spreaders into place to ensure horizontal growth? That's a great question on the branch spreaders. You can usually leave those in sometimes it only takes one growing season. It'll get the branches growing the right direction, and then after that you can remove them. You can check them after a year. If the branch still wants to kind of move upward, put the branch spreader back in, maybe lengthen it, put it in a different spot to get your angles right and get the direction right. But usually only after 1 year, maybe 2 at the most, especially on the really small ones. If you're using clothespins or something, you're going to get a good vigorous growth those first few years, and the branches start to really thicken out. And the little clothespin and stuff isn't going to do much good, but it's just getting it growing the right direction from the beginning, rather than trying to train it later when the branches are too thick to move and bend. So just 1 or 2 years at the most. And then you can remove them, get them out of the way. If you don't want to leave things too long in the tree, because the tree starts growing around it, the tissues actually start to grow around whatever you've left in there. And then it possibly leaves a weak spot where that branch spreader was located, or it does some different, you don't want to damage the tree over time. What changes with citrus? Pretty much the same. Citrus are different. And because we don't live in a climate with citrus, I don't have anything about it. Honestly, I don't know much. There are some timing issues with pruning, and citrus, honestly, I don't think love a lot of pruning. From what I've read, you're going to do a little bit less pruning on citrus, but I'm sorry, I don't have enough background or experience with those, simply because of the climate we live in. I don't know. I haven't grown them. So if you live in an area with citrus, or you're growing it, those indoor smaller ones, do some searching on that, because honestly, I can't give you a good answer about citrus pruning. Same principles would apply as far as growth, directing growth, but how vigorous you can be on those is something I'm not as sure about. So I apologize, I can't answer that one as well. When should you apply an oil-based spray to your trees for insects control and aphids? Oh, Hattie Ann looks like maybe she's typing an answer for this one. I'll answer it anyway. I was going to get to horticultural oils. After you prune, typically, sometime in the spring, it's some of them have a window, and they'll tell you, apply 2 weeks before leaf bud or blossom break or something like that. So just kind of read the instructions on them. Most of the time, right after you prune, you can apply your oil-based, your horticultural oil-based sprays that do help control the insect eggs, smother those eggs, the aphids, and so forth. So I would look at your pruning window, and then right after you prune, just apply it, unless the product you're using specifies otherwise and gives you a specific window. You're good to apply that, right after you prune. But read the instructions on whatever you're using. Let's see. I have a few. It says I have a few branches on my apple and pear tree that are parallel to the ground, like exactly 90-degree angle from the trunk, but they seem to be doing well. Would you recommend to cut or keep? I've been afraid they might split, but at the end of each season, they're still hanging on. The 90-degree angle is fine, just like what I talked about. You actually have a good structured branch coming straight off of the tree. If they're angled downward, anything that grows off of that one, you may prune it off so it steers it back upwards. But just straight out horizontal from the tree, unless they're too low for you, I would leave them alone. It's not a bad angle. Any 90-degree angle is fine. It's not going to be too weak. Over time, they're going to grow, and they'll actually form a good, strong branch. I don't know how old this tree is, but if they're not in your way and not too low, I would leave them. I actually kind of like the look of a wider, open tree like that myself. And if it was my tree, I'd leave it, and unless they're in your road, and go ahead and move those. One other question here. I've been trying to get a grapevine to grow from the bottom side of an arbor in my backyard. I think I'm getting too much water on the bottom side of the grape, keeps dying. Is there something I can do to plant the grape here to create greater drainage and elevation? Successful grow a grape on the bottom side of an arbor. Yes, grapes can be susceptible to overwatering. I would just check what's the source of this water. If it's sprinklers, if it's something else, you can maybe do some things to direct drainage away from that location, to try to not have it in a soggy spot. If you've tried repeatedly, maybe try to put it on a different area of the arbor and just let it, as it grows, it'll eventually cover the arbor. Try a different side of the arbor or something, moving it around just a little bit, or it's trying to figure out if that's just a low spot and all the water ends up there. That is a problem, and I don't know if you can change the grade by adding more soil or do something like that. If it simply isn't going to work, then maybe look for something else. But grapes are usually pretty hardy. Once you get them growing, they're going to be fine. It's going to be just getting that started. If it's a really soggy spot, just too wet and it just keeps rotting, you can maybe put some gravel underneath it below it to allow the water to drain away a bit, dig it deeper, apply some gravel in the bottom, then put the soil in. Maybe something like that helps get a little bit more of the water down and out of the way. Give that a try, or just a different place on the arbor might work. I am going to talk about pruning grapes. So some of you, maybe I'll skip any more grape questions. One question was, am I going to talk about pruning grapes? Yes, that's coming up here in the end. So we'll get to grapes. Let's see. Do we have a, let me see. Do you have a bowl dug out around the tree, or can your grass come right around the trunk? Hetty Ann's typing this, but I'll answer it too. Ideally, if you have a fruit tree in your grass, embedded in lawn, ideally get the grass away from the trunk. You'll have less issues with damage, mechanical damage from mowing and trimming on the trunk, and less potential damage from rodents or others right up against the tree. In addition to, there is some competition for water and nutrients around that tree. So I'll recommend what they call a tree well. Get the grass out around from the tree a couple feet in, a couple feet in each, well, from the trunk all the way around. So you have your radius 2 to 3 feet around that tree. Clear the grass out, put some mulch in there, something to keep moisture in, but you don't have to worry about mowing, mechanical damage, or anything like that. That would be my recommendation there. So it looks like we've kind of cleared those questions. Let me get back to the central leader. We'll get to more questions again about bugs and some of the issues and different things there. Okay, or Hetty Ann can keep typing in some of those answers as we go. But let me get back to the central leader. So a central leader tree, it focuses on getting, again, a strong main trunk and with scaffold branches below it at different layers. Now here I've got 18 to 24 inches from the ground. This all depends on you. If it's in a yard where you got to mow and get under it, you may want that 3 to 4 feet from the ground, just so you can get under it easily. Evenly distributed scaffolds, 6 to 8 feet apart, 6 to 8 inches apart vertically. I'll show you some examples of this. You'll head the terminal bud above where the second scaffold will be. And I'll show you this, okay? Just so you can know what I'm talking about here. You're gonna have 2 to 3 primary scaffolds, and here's some details of those, but I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. So let's move to this, developing the central leader. If this is your new tree, then this is what you want to typically do. You're developing a central leader. So we've talked about heading cuts. When you head it, it's going to stimulate lateral growth. But in this case, all these little branches, apples and pears are notorious for this. They're going to send up vertical growth close together. That's just what I talked about with branch spreaders and all this stuff. But you can head those. When you head those and then put branch spreaders in, notice what you're doing. You've started some lateral growth on each of those that you headed. I'll go back to this. Each one of those just has not very much growth. You've spread it open, you've headed them off. They're going to start growing more lateral growth. So this is after a couple of years, second growing season. Now, after another growing season, notice you've continued to spread. Now notice the layers. You kind of got the bottom layer, and then moving up a notch, you've got another scaffold, and then you can even go a third. And as this tree grows, depending on how high you want it to grow, you're going to have at least 2 scaffolds and maybe a third. And usually at that point, the tree is tall, fairly tall, and you may not want to have it go any taller than that. And so then you're keeping it to that size. You have 3 main large scaffold systems in there, and you're going from that point. Now, if your tree is mature and it's not like this, again, you work with the tree you have, and maybe over time you're cutting out a few large branches that are in the way, that are thick, and it's just crowded, and you'll eventually be able to form it into a nice scaffold system tree. But again, they'll still produce. A fruit tree will still produce. These are just some guiding principles for good starting structures. But if you already have something, you work with what you have, and just knowing where the buds are again. All right. So over time, you end up with this. Notice the branches are continually spread. So this goes back to that question about 90-degree angles. Notice these, they're starting to go out 90 degrees, nice and wide, open. So you still have a strong central leader though. That trunk is going right up the middle, and the main branches off of it. That's the difference between central leader and open vase. Open vase, you cut all that out and you have just main branches coming from kind of a general lower point. So here's a little illustration that shows correct pruning versus incorrect pruning. Correct pruning at the top, incorrect pruning at the bottom. Again, if you just let those vertical branches grow up, don't do a lot of pruning on them, don't do a lot of spreading on them, the tree will be more narrow and more crowded over time. Now, it'll still branch. There's still going to be lateral branching in there. And over time, it'll still widen out. You're still going to have a wider tree. But structurally, the joints of the tree won't be as well. The shape of the tree won't be as well, as well structured. And you're just not going to have as good of a healthy, strong tree as you would have had you done it this other way. It'll still produce. There's wild trees out there, apples that have been neglected for decades. They're still producing apples, but they're just kind of a mess structurally. And so this is just a management system, right? So hopefully this has addressed a lot of questions. This is helping you see, kind of envision what you're doing. The way you can achieve this is, again, knowing when to head and when to thin on a branch. When do I bring that all the way down to another branch? When do I just head it off and steer growth a different direction? And you can do that, and it's just practice. It's just look, when you're in a tree, looking at the tree, you'll get a feel for how this happens, and you'll be able to gain confidence and do this over time. So fruit thinning, why you want to do this, it'll produce a better quality fruit. It promotes annual bearing instead of the every other year bearing that I talked about. And it'll protect the tree from damage, from overweight, larger fruit, less pests, all kinds of things. One thing to talk about that I didn't mention, there will naturally apples will kind of thin themselves a little, but they don't thin themselves a ton. They'll still have lots and lots of fruit and be overwhelmed. But there's a phrase called June drop, and you'll notice this sometimes if you have an apple tree. There's a period where the apples have formed, they're maybe the size of a nickel or so, and all of a sudden some of them will just shrivel up and start falling off the tree. Well, that's just because the tree has too much and it can't produce, it cannot support that much fruit. And so it's going to naturally just get rid of some of that load. So you'll see some of those fall off. A lot of trees will do this. They'll just drop some of the fruit naturally. Don't worry about that. It's not a problem with your tree. Your tree's not sick. It's just overloaded. You'll still want to do additional thinning of those apples or pears or whatever the case is, because there's so much on there, and you won't want to throw your tree into that every other year cycle. All right. One thing I should mention too about thinning, some general rules of thinning, I don't think I have more slides on this, is on apples, they're usually forming a cluster of 5. There's usually 5 blossoms all together in a cluster. And so it's going to make you feel ill. They're just like, whoa, I'm taking off all this fruit. Ideally, if you want nice big apples, less problems with worms, because worms usually are where the moths lay the eggs, and they kind of between apples and stuff. So you're actually probably going to thin off all but one of those 5. Now there's going to be clusters of 5 everywhere, so you're going to still have plenty of fruit. If you just can't bear to do that, we'll take off 3 of the 5. And if you can't bear to do that, take off 2 of the 5. But you're going to end up with more fruit. More fruit in relation to seeds. The fruit will be larger, and you'll just help the tree manage and deal with the overload and the energy expenditure that it's trying to make in seeds. So thin that out. And peaches generally, nectarines, there's a rule that you shouldn't have a peach closer than about they say 8 inches. I usually use my fingers from my thumb to my pinky. If you spread those out, that distance between each fruit, and it's going to make you sick. When I've thinned peaches off my little trees, sometimes they're the size of a quarter when I'm thinning them, or maybe just a tad larger, and I've filled 5-gallon buckets full of peaches, and you're just like, oh, if these things matured, think of all the fruit I'd have. Well, you'd have a lot more fruit, but they'd be smaller, and you're just overloading your tree. And then I still have plenty of fruit, and they're larger and nicer to deal with. So do thin your trees, it'll help. If you have just huge apple trees, it's hard to get out there and thin and really go through the whole tree, but do the best you can to thin those out just a little bit, and you'll be better off. Now let's talk about pruning unruly trees. Big mature trees haven't been pruned in a while. We've already talked about that decision time. Is this a tree that's just unmanageable, that I just can't recover? It's a tree I don't even love. Maybe it's a red delicious apple. A few people love those. They look pretty, but I don't think they taste very good. And so maybe you're thinking, I just don't love this tree and it's not what I want. Maybe you do want to cut it down. Maybe you want to grow something else, get it out of the way and grow something else. And granted, it takes time, and it'll make you sad to cut down that tree. It always makes me sad to cut down a tree. But if you just don't love it, get rid of it and get something you love. And then in 3 years from now, 5 years from now, you'll have a new tree. It'll be young, it'll be shaped properly, and you'll be getting what you want off of that tree. Generally speaking, you're not supposed to prune more than 1/3 of the tree at a time, because you're stimulating growth. If you prune really heavily, like that picture I showed you way at the beginning, if you prune really heavily, what you're going to end up doing is stimulating all kinds of lateral growth. So growth everywhere. It'll be really thick and really dense. Now, if you understand that and can deal with that the next couple years, you can recover a very unruly tree by doing that. And I'll show you that in a video at the end. Don't fertilize the tree during corrective pruning, meaning if you're heavily pruning a tree, don't fertilize it, because all that does is add to the vigor of the growth and all kinds of crazy lateral new growth. It makes it very, very thick. Now, to illustrate that point, I don't have a picture of it. Some of you have seen people when they pollard a tree, meaning they cut it all the way down, basically, not all the way to the ground, but they leave a trunk. People do this with catalpa trees all the time. They cut off all the growth, and then the next year, it's just so thick and full. It just looks like this nice, dense little lollipop ball on top of a trunk. Well, if you're into that kind of a design, it's usually not what people want in a fruit tree. But on ornamentals, people do that sometimes. They do very vigorous cuts and stuff every single year because they want dense, vigorous growth. And they just keep doing it every single year because of the aesthetic appeal that it creates. Fruit trees usually aren't known for that. So you kind of want to avoid that if you want good fruit production and not just lateral growth every single year. Yeah, if you totally butcher a tree and cut it way down just to trunks, you're not likely to get much fruit. Maybe if you leave a few spurs, you'll have a few here and there, but you're just going to have mostly growth that next year. So never prune off more than 1/3. I've already talked about that. One person prunes, second opinions increase divorce rates. Sorry, I got to throw some humor in. It's kind of true though. Everyone's style is a little different. And I've heard, other instructors, we have some Utah State staff help us sometimes. And they're like, if you're going to prune and you both love to prune, your relationship and your spouse, well, then one of you choose one tree, one of you choose another, and you each prune your own tree. Because if you sit and talk about what needs to come and what will come off, what doesn't, you'll sit and eventually fight about it. And that's never good for anybody. So don't fight about it. One person prunes, the other person prunes their own tree, and you'll be happier. And just know that you'll have your style and they'll have their style, and it's going to be okay. It takes time to get comfortable and confident. So be patient with yourself. Don't panic. If you make a mistake and cut off a branch and go, oh no, I shouldn't have cut that. Well, I've done that. And you know what? The tree will survive and it'll grow again. It'll grow back. It maybe not that same branch in that same place, but it keeps growing. And so sometimes you'll cut something off and like, wow, I should have left that. It's okay. Just you keep going, you gain confidence, and over time you'll get really good at knowing what comes off, what stays, and shaping how you like the look of the tree. All right. So with that, before I get into grapes, let's go through some questions here, and then I'm going to go through some grapes. And there's going to be more questions because I'm going to show you a couple things to just kind of illustrate, kind of reinforce the principles I've just taught. One is there a way to avoid worms in apples without spraying them? The short answer to that question is no. Not really. There are some organic methods you can use. Utah State Extension here locally has that. Most of the state and county extension offices have information about organic spraying and when to apply and how frequently products you use. But typically, if you don't spray, you'll have worms. Now, I should mention though, store and production, orchard production, they can't sell a wormy apple. But you at your home, you can eat a wormy apple. And because you just cut it out. You cut out the little worm spot, you cut out the core that's wormy, and you still eat the rest of the apple. So some people don't worry about that. They're like, yeah, worms, it's fine. I cut that part off anyway. Now, if you have a heavy infestation, just a bad worm year, you lose a lot of apples, and stuff. It can cause them to rot and fall off the tree. But for some people, they don't mind. They're just like, you know what? I don't want to spray. I don't want to bother. I will cut the wormy part out of my apples. If that's you, go ahead and do that. You're fine. But production, orchard production and the market production, they can't sell a wormy apple, so they will spray them and they'll do things to avoid wormy apples. And if you're worried about that and you don't want worms, you must do something. There's lots of methods to do that. When is the best time to thin fruit? Usually you're thinning fruit when it's about the size of a nickel to a quarter. When the fruit is about that size, you will go out and start picking them or cutting them off. Be careful if you're pulling them off. Now, peaches, it's easy, you just pull them off. Apples, because they're in that cluster 5, if you pull one, sometimes you get the whole cluster. So you may have to just snip those off a little bit or just twist them a little bit as you pull. But you're thinning them typically when they're that size. A nickel to a quarter in size is a great time to be pruning, or thinning, excuse me. So let's go to the next one. Are worms a problem in cherry trees? I spray them, but always seem to be present. Yes, locally worms in cherry trees are a problem. Spraying cherries, you have to be on it all the time. There's a window actually. Most of the time that window is once the cherries start turning a blush color, that's when they need to be sprayed. You can do it. You can achieve worm-free cherries, but follow the products and there's a timing. You have to be timing it just right, or you'll miss it and you'll still have wormy cherries. And some people, I will just throw this out there, it's gross to think about. Some people think, the worm's just been eating a cherry, it tastes like a cherry, just don't open them and you'll never know. Now that's gross to a lot of people. Like, what? You're gonna eat those worms? I'm sure I've eaten wormy cherries before, because you just don't open them and then you try not to think about it. But if you don't want wormy cherries, you do have to spray them, and the timing is very specific for wormy cherries. Okay. All right. So we've answered those questions. I'm going to move on to grapes, and then I'm going to do some little demonstrations and stuff and show you some things here. So don't bail out on me yet. We've got a little bit more to go, and we've got just a little bit more time here. Pruning grapes is also, there's some systems for it. There's some specifics for it, but you know what? Grapes are very forgiving, and grapes, if you can leave them alone. If you want them to grow big on a big old, on a big trellis system or over the top of a gazebo or something. Let me just show you some of the main things. The Niffin system is what it's called, 4 canes. This is what, like real vineyards are doing. They've got, they're interested in production on various types of grapes and maximizing space and everything else. So you've got one main trunk trained on 2-wire trellis system or a 1-wire trellis system. They're using 4 canes. Each of those canes are 1-year-old, and you leave a certain amount of buds. So you can actually count the buds on each cane and leave a certain percentage, 40 to 60% of the plant. And then every year a renewal spur will grow, and you can cut some of the old ones off. And so you're always dealing with 1-year-old wood, and then the 1-year-old wood puts off new shoots, and that's where the grapes form. Okay, so you'll think about renewal spurs, buds, and next year's fruiting wood. So let me show you some other examples here. So here's an example. You got spurs, fruiting spurs coming off the very main trunk. And then see on this illustration, the little buds everywhere the branch bends, that's a new bud. And so some people literally count those buds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They'll get out 10 buds or 12 buds or whatever number they want. And that's where they cut it. They just cut it off. They head cut it right about the bud, and they've spread out the top and bottom scaffold, on a wire. Some people have these wires at about 5 feet, so maybe 6, and another one 2 feet below that, so 4 or 3, and easy to reach, easy to manage. And then from there, all the new growth is trained across those wires, and all the grapes will form on that growth. Okay, so that's one system. Now you see people grow grapes on fences, on trellises, over arbors and gazebos, right? So the same principles can apply. You can trim off a lot of the growth, but you can leave more. You can leave a taller main trunk, and you can leave a, more of the lateral growth, so to speak, and prune it back to where you want it, and it'll still produce. Grapes are very vigorous, they're very hardy, they're very tough. But how you do this on a trellis is you select the canes, of course, your bull canes, and we won't talk too much about those, but you just avoid the weak canes, and you're forming some big, strong ones. And then you mark or tape the 4 keepers, tie them out to the wire, and then you remove everything else. And except for a couple renewal spurs that are real close to the trunk. Now, if you want to renew a grape that's just overgrown and it's huge, it hasn't been pruned in a long time, you can remove 80 to 90% of the whole plant back to a one large main trunk, and it'll grow again from there, and you can start training it again from there. So grapes are actually pretty simple. They're not hard to deal with at all once they're growing. Now, the question about getting one started, once you get it going, they're drought tolerant, they're hardy, they're just tough, they're cold hardy most of the time, at least the ones that grow locally here. But the issues you're going to have with grapes are certain varieties need a longer growing season than some climates allow. So you're going to have to look for varieties that fit within the growing season you're dealing with, as far as number of days, number of months that you have. And if you have the long enough growing season, you could grow any grape for that growing period, and you'll get good harvest, and they'll be great. Here's some pictures. So this is an actual vineyard. Notice, they've got a couple wires there. They've got the black tubing there is actually some watering systems and stuff. So they've got hooked up, so it'll drip water near the grapevine, water it through that area. This one happens to have grass below it, or some sort of an orchard grass. But notice they've cut everything back to these main trunks. Now the renewal spurs are actually on those little stubs, and all of those are going to grow new vines, and then off of that 1-year-old new vine is going to form all the grapes. So every year they're going to kind of prune it back to this point in a vineyard. If you like that look and that's the space you have, then do this. If not, it doesn't have to look like this. Maybe it looks like this. You've got a trellis, you're not going to prune all this back because you want the shade on top. So you're going to leave some main structure. You can have main branches that are 10 feet long that go up and over the top, but you could cut off all of the smaller little growth every single year. So essentially you're doing this kind of structure, but you're leaving it taller, and now it's up on top, and then you're pruning off things back to the stub ends. If you want this filled in every year to be shade, to be nice, or, my parents had a grapevine on the side of their house for years. We cut it back a little bit, but it covered the whole side of their house. It was on some wires all up the side. We cut it back a little bit. The thing was prolific. It was a Concord grape. It produced every year, just fantastic. So don't worry too much about this kind of structure, unless you don't have space and you really want to get into like a vineyard type production and you like that look. Don't worry too much. Grapes are pretty easy. So with that, let me address any questions here. One is there a law that requires you to spray cherries in Utah? I think if you're a commercial grower, yes. In your own home, no. There's no law that you have to spray them. You can deal with wormy cherries, excuse me, if you want. Or there are some organic methods. Once again, look on your county extension resources for the different products that are organic and the timing. You can check on what they call the pest advisories, and there's some recommendations for different chemicals and timing on those. Do sour cherries require the same amount of spraying as sweet cherries? No, that's a great question too. Typically, no. The sour cherries are ripening at a different time. Although you can still have some wormy sour cherries. I have a sour cherry, a Montmorency cherry in my house, and we've harvested those. They're early. I've not sprayed them. Typically, there's no worms in them, and we just deal with them that way. If we find an occasional worm, we're usually cutting them open when you pit them. If we find an occasional worm, we just throw that one out and just move on. But no, on the sour cherries, they're usually not the same issues with the worms as the sweet cherries. Is the pruning for apples the same as pears? great question. The answer is typically yes. Apples and pears, usually central leader. Nectarines, peaches, usually open vase. Plums and apricots can be either. But if you like an open vase, you can prune your apples and pears that way as well. But typically pruning apples and pears the same because they both produce fruit on spurs. So you do need to pay attention to those spurs, just like I talked about. How do you keep the raccoons away from grapes? You get a trap. I don't have any other answers for that. If you have raccoon problems, they're going to cause a lot more problems than just on your grapes. You can call the Division of Wildlife. I don't know that they'll help you out there. You can set some traps. There may be some repellents that keep them out, but I don't have a great answer for that one. I'm sorry.
My dad uses an electric fence to keep it away from our corn.
There you go. An electric fence could work. Yeah, but you'd have to use some sort of an extreme method like that because raccoons are just a pest all the way around. So sorry about that. Do pests affect grapes and recommended? Let's see. Do pests affect grapes and recommended spreading? Typically, no. There's not a lot of pests for grapes. You may see some leaf miners in the leaves occasionally that you don't really typically have to worry about. I'm not sure what the recommended spreading means. You don't have to spread grapes or spread the branches or anything. They're just going to grow. So you need something for them to grow on, a trellis, a fence, some sort of structure for them to grow on. But no, pests are not a problem, but definitely give them some support to grow on. And anyway, yeah, I hope that answered that question. So do pruning grapes at the same time of year as you do fruit trees? Yes, typically in the spring, you could start pruning them now. And it's not a problem. I've seen people prune them in the fall and it's not a problem, but if you have a really hard cold winter, you may get a little bit of winter kill if you prune in the fall. But I have seen people prune grapes in the fall and they haven't seemed to be a problem, but I would recommend pruning them now. Prune them now at the same time before they start budding out. Same time as you do your fruit trees. It's just a good time to do it. Takes care of everything at the same time. So let's go to, is blackberry pruning too far off topic? I've moved into a new home without controlled blackberries. A little bit, it's a little separate deal. Blackberries are really prolific. You can cut them to the ground actually, and they'll just come back. So if they're out of control, cut them way back, all the way back. You may lose a little bit of production the first year, or you can cut them down to about 3 feet or 4 feet in length. Try to train them up a little bit onto something. Depends on the variety of blackberry, but blackberries can be very prolific, just spread like crazy. They root in if they touch the ground a lot of times. So pruning your blackberries, you can be very aggressive with them. You're not going to kill them. Even digging up some of them up if needed, do that. But certainly you can cut them way back and you're not gonna hurt them. Invernal, the worms in our sour cherries are worse. So in certain places, maybe that is the case. I haven't had any issues, but if you do notice worms in your sour cherries, you just want to start applying something. Look for the organic methods, look for sprays. If you're having issues with it, then definitely spray them if you don't want the worms. Cherries in Utah have just become, it's the western cherry fly. Anyway, it's a fly that lays its egg. Just a problem. Even commercial growers have a difficulty with wormy cherries here now. I almost don't bother. I don't have a sweet cherry tree in my yard just because of that. I don't want to bother with them. To me, it's almost worth just buying a few cherries when they're in season and eating them. How old can cherry trees get before they don't produce? That's a good question. I don't know the exact age. There may be someone else here that knows that. They will over time decline. They don't live as long as an apple tree for sure. So if you have an old cherry tree that's maybe 25, 30 years old or something, and you're starting to see it die back, usually they won't just produce, or they won't just stop producing. They'll start dying back and production could slow, but I don't know the age. So I'm sorry about that. I don't know that. When should you put in netting? When should you put netting on grapes to keep the birds off? When they start to sweeten up, usually is when birds start attacking the grapes. So they start changing color, especially like the concords and stuff. That's when, if you want to do netting to keep the birds out, just wait till they start turning color. And you can even kind of tell, you can sometimes smell the grapes are starting to get sweet. They kind of have a nice sweet smell about them, but just start watching them. As soon as they start changing color. Now, if they're a green sweet table grape, you may have to watch a little more closely, sample them yourself once in a while to see if they're starting to get sweet, and then cover them after that. Is there a simple way to keep birds from eating your apples? Short of netting? No, there's not. There's really not. Birds are a problem. They'll eat your nectarines. They'll go after your peaches. They'll go after your other fruit. There's not an easy way, honestly, for birds. You can net your tree. You can try to put some detractors out there that scare the birds away, but no, not a good. It's just tough. If you've got birds that do that, put a net. That's the best answer. Let's see. I have a cherry tree that has been declining over the last 5 years. I've had to remove branches and the trunk is splitting. A lot of sap comes out of it. Should I just start with a new tree? Yeah, I would recommend if you love the cherries, start with a new tree. If you don't really love the cherries, put in a different tree, or a different type of tree. But if you love the cherries and you want a cherry tree, I would recommend starting with another tree. If it's declining, it's just having issues, it will eventually die. It'll continue struggling and have issues and just die. So I would start with another. How do I know which grapevine is 1 year old? It's usually the smaller branches. The older vine part of your grapevine is going to get really woody. It'll start to get thick. The newer ones are just going to be thin, maybe about the size of your little finger thin. And so you don't worry too much about that. You can just kind of cut it back. Once you cut it back enough, you'll certainly know, because the old wood is still there and it gets bigger and thicker and woody. And so it'll be really easy to notice where you've cut it back to, but don't worry too much about 1 year old wood. It's whatever grew that year. If you're pruning in the spring, whatever grew that previous summer, that's what you'd prune off. And then you just kind of work from there. Now, if you're recovering, you can go further than that. You can cut it back even further. So really quick, I'm going to move now to just a couple live things, do a quick little demonstration. And if you want to hang around longer, I'll do a short little couple videos of me demonstrating. This class is being recorded. It'll be available the first part of the week. So with that, then, let me just switch out of here. And let's do, hold on, I'm gonna do something quicker. I didn't really show you a couple things too. Typical little hand saws like this work great. Just a little foldable saw if you've got just some small branches to deal with. The size of loppers, this is a typical loppers. These are just basic. You got your hand pruners, basic loppers. I didn't show you them. If you need something a little bigger, they do sell bigger loppers. This one happens to be a longer handle, bigger opening here for larger branches. So let me do this. I'm gonna move my computer over here so you can see, hopefully. All right, so now this is kind of an attempt to help you see a couple things. This is indoor. This is a small tree that I just picked up in the nursery. This size of pot, I think it's a number 5 or number 7. Now this is actually a nice looking tree from the nursery. Typically a $40 tree, $39 or something. You buy this one's an apple tree. I also have here a nectarine tree, and I think what I'll do first. Well, let me show you on the apple tree first. It's the principles I showed you. This is a young apple tree. Now this one actually has really good structure. Notice the branches are actually coming out pretty good this way. They're not going strongly vertical. Sometimes you have branches, they're really close together. They're just a few inches apart. This one actually has the branching that's growing out pretty good, but we could still spread these. We could still put something on them and get the branches growing out just a little more. But what I wanted to show you on a brand new tree like this, it's got a terminal bud. My camera up just a tad so you can see the tip. So it does have the tip up here. You got some branching structure here. I'll kind of turn this a little bit You can see, sometimes it's hard to get a perspective from the camera. Now notice right here in the middle, let me turn this back a little bit. Right here, it's been cut, and then they actually took this branch here that I'm holding. They took this branch and taped it up right next to that cut part, so that they created a they did a heading cut here to stimulate some lateral growth, but they still wanted to create a central leader. So they took the very top branch that's growing and just pulled it into that one and taped it so that you'd continue to get a central leader. This one's now in charge, but you got some lateral growth. And they did this probably, you know, a year or two before this tree is actually sold in the nursery. So what I wanted to show you on a tree like this, knowing where the pot is, I would probably, so I'm going to shift this down again, just a tad. The pot from this point here is really only about 18 inches, maybe 20 inches away from this branch. So once you put this in the ground, like out of the ground, it's clear up here, you know, 3 feet or so. But out of the ground, in the ground, that's going to only be 2 feet. So I don't want it that low. So I would take that branch off. And the same with this little one over here. So those are some things you're considering is, what do I take off of this new tree? What do I have to do with it? The general structure actually looks great, so I don't worry too much about that. Because it's going to have scaffolds. Remember, we want some layering. We want a layer of scaffold here, maybe a layer of scaffold here, but also knowing which directions the branch are going, so it's all the way around. I will look at this tree, and then, you know, this branch and this branch are kind of going the exact same direction. They're paralleling each other. So I think because this one's a little taller, it's in the way, I would cut that one off. Looking here at the top, up here, it's going to have the problem going back and forth. Up here, you know, it's branching up here. It's not a problem. This will probably be my third layer. So I'm actually going to choose a bud up here somewhere. I'm going to choose both of these, a bud that's going the other direction. And I'm going to head this because I want more growth. It'll start growing more out, but I've got a scaffold here, got one here, got one here. You could leave that if you wanted your tree to get a lot taller with more of a central leader. And then this bud is going this direction, so I'd cut it right above that. And then these others, this one's kind of it's going to be a little taller. So to keep my tree growing outward, I'm going to choose a bud growing outward, and I'll just head that off right there. You know, same thing, I can head a few of these with the buds going the right direction. It'll just help stimulate a little bit of the lateral growth on this young tree. But for the most part, you know, this one actually down here, for the most part, this tree actually looks really good. Now, it may be kind of hard to tell from your angle, but that's actually a pretty nice looking little tree. That's just from the nursery. Okay, so with that apple tree, kind of going to be done with this little apple. This thing would be ready to plant in the ground. Now I could have waited and pruned this. This one's broken, so I'm going to take that out. I could have waited and just planted this and then pruned it in the field. That would have worked just fine. But for the most part, I'm just going to get that one out of the way a little bit. And let's pull this nectarine tree in here. Hopefully you can see this well enough. Now, with the nectarine tree, with this nectarine, I'm going to move this tag because I still want to know what this tree is, but I'm going to show you something that might seem a little drastic. Okay, it's got lots of branches here and it's tall. I'm about 6 feet tall. This is just a little bit taller than me. Nice structure though, if you think about the branches and where it's growing. But because, again, this has a nice central leader, but because I prefer to have a nectarine tree in a vase, an open vase, I need to be deciding, where can I cut this tree? Where can I start a vase? Now this branch down here, well, you can't see it, is about 2 feet from the ground. Overall, I think I want the structure of the tree taller than that. So I'm going to actually cut that one off. You didn't see that too. It was kind of low for you to see in the camera. So there's another one here I'm going to cut off. Let me just angle the camera, sorry. Back and forth, back and forth. So this one here, there's this branch down here low. It's still a little low for me once this gets into the ground. So I'm going to cut that off. Okay, Now, these branches, what I have left here is a fairly nice structure. I wish the background was a little better. So we've got good branching coming out here. We've got some coming out the back. We've got some coming out here. So honestly, we have 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, 5 here. And if I look at those 5, they're all going the right directions. I've got some going basically each direction I want. This one could be pushed down a little to spread it, but each direction I want. So realistically, if I want an open vase on this tree, this is what makes people a little bit crazy, is they're like, wow, you've got this nice tree. Well, you come in here with your loppers or your hand pruners, depending on the size of this trunk, and you simply, oh no, people panic because when you look at this, I basically cut off the top half of my tree. And to some people, it's just so hard to do. But if I want an open vase tree, now here it is. Here's the structure of my tree. I've got, there's some little ones in here that are kind of broken. So I can just tidy that up a little bit. It's not gonna hurt. There's some crossing ones in here. This one's kind of going up funny. So there it is. This will now form, it's a little hard to tell in the background. This will form a very nice open vase. It's got branches coming out each direction. And as this grows, it's going to form a nice, well-balanced, nice looking nectarine tree. So this is really all I need to do for the first year. Next year, these branches will get longer, get thicker. There'll be new growth in the middle, and I'll continue my outward pruning, just looking at things that are growing straight up and cut them out, look at the direction of the buds, and over time cut them out. With this, this we could maybe do some more demonstrations, on thinning cuts. Here's the whole structure, a thinning cut, you'd come clear back to here and cut that thing. Another thinning cut, clear back to here and cut that thing. Heading cuts, you'd cut it above a bud, cut it above a bud. Those are heading. Anyway, demonstration. So 2 little trees that we've got here. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of help as far as what to do with some just very young trees. So I've got now let me address a couple questions and a little bit of back and forth. So let's address a question here. Do you have to put something on the fresh cuts to keep the bugs out? The answer is no. Most of the time, don't treat anything on. Some people will paint them and everything. Some recent studies from Utah State Extension that we've had locally here is that it's actually best just to not do anything with the cuts. Let the tree just naturally heal them. Don't need to worry about bugs or fungus. If you have a problem with fire blight in apples or anything like that, then you can clean your pruners before you cut each time. So just dip them in a little Clorox solution. Now, some of you, it's not over yet. If you want, I'm going to show a couple little pre-done video clips on some mature trees. So if you want to hang around for a minute, I'm going to show those and do a little demonstration that way, and then we'll answer more questions. But anyway, so on a couple other questions here, do you do a heading cut above the fruiting bud or the leaf bud? Typically when you're heading, it's just going to be a leaf bud. You're going to see just a little bud forming there, and you cut right above the bud. The bud is going the direction you want it to go. One other question was, could the big cut part of the nectarine be rooted? Typically, no. There may be some smaller branches you could cut off and root them. If you use rooting hormone, people will use that fresh, what they call, is it sapwood? Anyway, to do grafting and different things. So some of those could probably be rooted. That whole big piece, not likely. If you're into rooting and rooting hormones and different things, you could probably get a little bit of that. Do pear trees produce every year? Typically, yes, they should. They can also get in that cycle of every other year, just like apples, but they should produce every year. So let's see. With that, okay, that's all the questions for a minute. Let me just jump right into this video. So I'm going to share this. I'm going to start with the peach tree, okay, 5-year-old peach tree. And we're gonna just do, here it is. So let me just share this. We'll do a 5-year-old peach tree. It's just a few minutes long. I've sped it up. We're gonna start from the beginning of the tree to the end of the tree. It's not too long. I think it's about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, something like that. And then we'll stop and pause some questions. Then we'll go to an apple tree, and then we'll do a couple others if you have time. Oops. Where did it go? Okay, I think you're not seeing this yet. Hold on just a second. I'm gonna share again. My video is just playing without us here. Hold on. Sorry about that. Let me just share again. Here we are. Okay, now you should be, we'll be able to see this. Let me go, I'm gonna go back just a bit here. Okay, here we go.
We're not hearing the sound, Dave. You may need to share your sound as well.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me pause. Let's see, here we go. Hold on. You're not hearing any sound?
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, hold on. We'll get it. Here we go. Sharing sound. You got it. Let me go back again. Here we go. Let me know if it's not sound again.
That's good.
Okay.
So I've already showed you the tools. I've already showed you, different cuts, different types of cuts to make, different things. So here's a 5-year-old peach tree. Now we're going to demonstrate on a couple different trees and show you the different cuts and different structure. On this particular tree, notice it's opened up. The vase, it's a vase shape. There's a central leader would be coming up in the middle, but this has been pruned out early so that you have a vase-shaped structure coming outward this way. And typically with your peaches, your plums, apricots, these kind of trees, that's a typical structure you'll see in commercial orchards and homegrown peaches as well. But you can leave a central leader peach. This way tends to just open it up, strengthen the tree, give it the durability so it doesn't break apart when you have heavy peaches on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just prune this whole tree. For this size of tree, and because it's been pruned over the years, I'm really just going to be using hand pruners, but I do have some loppers if I need. Remember from the principles, we're looking for dead, diseased, and dumb branches first, and then we'll go into the other branches, getting it to the size of the height we need, and just structural shape and size. So first of all, I'll kind of come around and look. Here's a stub that's just kind of coming out. So I'm interested in the shape and of course production. So with peaches, you don't have to worry about where it's producing fruit. It's producing fruit on 1-year-old wood. So all these pink ones, these all grew last year. They're all going to produce fruit. There's going to be fruit production down here in the middle. So you don't want to cut off everything, but easily with peaches, you can take off a complete, third up to a half of the branches on a peach tree, have it be very productive and really a good structure and shape and strength of a tree. So I'm just going to get going with this. This one, it hasn't had super vigorous growth from last year. I had a couple issues with this tree last year. Sometimes in a peach tree this young, you'll see vigorous growth of 6 feet in 1 year. The branches will be about 1 inch in diameter. This year, let's just go ahead and get started. So I'm going to look for a lot of, some funny little branches here in the middle, and I'll be walking around the tree the whole time, and I'm kind of just looking for things that are crossing, things that are going to get in the way of each other, things that don't, they're not going to make sense. Some of these are just going to be little guys. Others I'm going to be cutting off whole branches, and I'll show you mostly when I start getting to the top. And so, you know, I'm cutting out these little size guys. Just looking at direction and which ones maybe come out. You know, here you probably can't see this super good, but here's a branch that's coming up. It's coming right into these others. I don't need that, so I'll cut it off. Now, as you'll notice, I'm also cutting really close, making nice cuts, just like I talked about in the class. You're making good, clean cuts close to the trunk. This thing here in the middle I'm going to leave because I don't really have anything on the back side here. This I'm going to hopefully train to come out the back over here. Now, well, let me keep going with this one for a minute. I will talk about, you know, occasionally you're going to have to do some heading cuts. Mostly what I'm doing is thinning cuts. I'm bringing it down into the actual joint of a branching joint. Occasionally you'll have some new things that'll come out, and you'll head these, and you just look for buds. Cut above a bud. The buds will go certain directions, so you can usually find a bud that's going the right direction, and you can cut just above that bud, and then that new thing, that'll start training to come outward rather than inward into the tree. So really, for the low part of this tree, there's not much to do. There's not a lot of pruning. There's not a lot of mess, or it's not really thick. If you've got a lot of vigorous growth in here, you're going to take a lot of that little stuff out. But in this particular tree, it's pretty open. So really, I'm going to be looking now at the top, to the height I want to bring this tree down, to give it the structure that I want and the shape that I want. Again, looking if there's any dead or diseased branches along the way. So I'm going to get out my loppers and actually just take down the largest branches. There might be a few little guys in here that don't need to be there. So I'll take a little look at it. Look at the height. Looks pretty even. Or maybe this one over here is a little tall. And I think for the most part, this peach tree is done. You know, I've brought it down to size. I've kept it open. Notice the structure. Once you've got a nice structure, you don't have to mess with this structure much. And then you end up with, you know, a very productive tree. There's still a few, now that I'm noticing, there's just a few here that look a little thick. Just on these little guys. They're just vegetative growth. You're still going to have plenty of blossoms, plenty of stuff in there. but this tree is overall finished. Now remember, every year this tree is going to continue to grow in structure and thickness, and so if you miss something this year, you can get it next year. So for the most part, this peach is done, and we can discuss any questions that you have after this.
Okay, so that was the peach tree. Now, that was a peach tree in my yard. I've had it, like I said, 5 years. Just kind of showed you a demonstration. I haven't seen any questions come through. If you have any questions about that one, let's address them right now. Otherwise, I want to move on and show you a quick thing with an apple tree that's a little more mature. So if there's no questions, I'll move right on to that next one. And oops, hold on. Give me a second. Give me 1 second here. Just the transition back and forth between the sharing here. Okay, here we go. I'll mention this is
Now I want to demonstrate some pruning on a mature apple tree. And so you'll notice this one has been pruned over the years. It's kept short. It's meant to be productive. The thing I want to make sure you're reminded of is the spurs. The fruiting spurs on apples are going to be found all over the branches. There's fruiting spurs. The darker colored wood is vegetative growth from last year, and we're going to cut a lot of that out. You got to remember, pruning an apple tree or a pear tree, you never want to prune off the spurs or you won't get any fruit. That's where the blossoms are going to form, and so you want to be careful not to get too carried away and prune off all your spurs. So this tree, of course, you've got quite a bit of growth in there. You've got the sprouts growing up in the middle. Not a lot of vigorous growth of feet, because it's a little bit more mature, so some of that growth is going to be slowed down. So I'll just start. I'm going to work my way around the tree. If there's bigger branches, I've got pruners, the hand pruners, the loppers, and we'll just get started and demonstrate a lot of stuff. So a lot of this vegetative growth, and a lot of times there's a spur at the base of these, so you can simply take that part off, leaving the spur. And I know you probably can't see that very good on video, but you can certainly leave the spur while still dealing with the vegetative growth to keep things thinned out. Here's an example of that right here. Crossing branches, rubbing branches, any of those you can take out. And some of these that are crossing in here, a lot of this is going to be just really small stuff. You won't worry about or feel bad about cutting out. But like this, a branch like this that starts growing into the other branch, I think we'll just take that whole thing off. And any of the branches, these vegetative growth coming off main stems, those are water sprouts. They'll eventually mature into wood, fruiting wood, but they're in the way, so you always just cut those out. And because this tree's kept short, I probably won't need a ladder to get to anything. If your tree was taller, you may need to get yourself up on a ladder so you could reach everything. I'm gonna do something drastic, and I hope the owner doesn't mind. There's a branch right here. This branch right here in the middle is kind of coming up in the middle. There's a lot here. If I take it out, it should open up, should let a little light, a little bit more light, a little less crowding right in the middle there. And I think the shape and the look of the tree will be nice. So I'll just take that guy out, and that kind of opens that, it opens up that little middle bit, not so congested in the middle. And then there's just a few more.
I will mention right here, it looks like I've left kind of a stub right there. There was another branch that goes to the back of the tree there that actually is a good structural branch. That's where I cut it. I cut it at that joint. And from the angle of the camera, it actually looks like a fairly large stub, which wasn't the case. It was kind of down to a joint structure where a branch went off the backside. Just wanted to clarify that for you.
A few more right here to basically finish this off. And that's actually and so what I'll do is I'll take a look, I'll take a little step back, I'll kind of look over the tree, but for the most part you'll notice, you know, a lot of I did prune off some spurs. You know, on some of these older branches, there are fruiting spurs here, but because of the congestion, this tree is still going to be very productive. There's still a lot of blossoms. You'll probably even still need to thin a tree like this, just have big apples. But for the most part, this is done. I'll walk around it again, just do a little double check. But that concludes our apple tree.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing that one for just a second. So if you have any questions about the apple tree, let's address those real quick here. Again, these are demonstrations. The apple tree and the pear tree I'll show you here in just a second if you're interested in staying around for a minute. Those were both my father-in-law's trees, and so he was comfortable with me demonstrating and pruning on those, and hopefully they're to his satisfaction. He's got a few others that I'm going to go back and help him on. So I'll show you a pear tree here coming up where we did some aggressive pruning. It had been one that hadn't been pruned for a few years. Let me just pull that one up here real quick, and we'll share that one. Wherever it went, it's here somewhere. There it is. So we'll give me a second, and I'll share this pear tree. It's again just about a 5-minute little segment, and then I hope that helps. And then we'll address any questions. We'll talk about anything else, and then we'll we can kind of move on from there. Okay, here we go. Oops. Sorry, my controls just hid my play button. There we go.
This is a mature pear tree, and so it hasn't been pruned much. It's been pruned before, but not in the last few years. So you can see it's a lot of growth in there. It's really crowded. It's also too tall. So I'm going to demonstrate how to, if you have a big mature tree like this, how to bring it down a little bit and recover it. Now, one thing to be aware of, anytime you do some aggressive pruning on a tree where you're taking a lot of material out, you're going to have a lot of new growth the next year. So I just want to caution you, we will be aggressive on this one, but if you want to minimize the growth, tackle a mature tree like this and try to spread it out over a couple years to bring it down. But we're going to go ahead and just try to bring this one down and to a reasonable height to pick the fruit, and also just to thin it out a bit. So I'm not, I'll talk a bit here, but mostly you're just going to watch as I'm going to get up in the tree and actually use a saw to cut some of the bigger ones out first, to then see what we have to go with.
If you're not adventurous in climbing trees, don't get up in the tree. I've always loved to climb trees ever since I was a little kid. So climbing trees was always a fun thing. So that's why I get up into the trees like this. A lot of people would probably get a ladder, be on a ladder doing something like this, or you find a neighbor kid that loves to climb trees, the half monkey kids, and have them do this for you.
Okay. So in the event that you have a tree like this, a little electric chainsaw comes in handy.
You can do all this with a handsaw, it just takes a little longer. So for the sake of timing and everything else for this, I opted to use my father-in-law's electric chainsaw. So I'm going to have to, I think I've been able to reach everything low that I can reach. So I'm going to have to get back up in the tree and begin thinning and cutting a few more. There's a few more big branches to take out of there. That we'll do with, I'll do that with the electric chainsaw. And then I'll use the big loppers once again to finish it off. So what we've done is a very aggressive pruning on this pear tree. I mean, we brought it way down, we've cut some major branches. Now that will result in a lot of new growth next year. And so, of course, the owner wanted to do this to get the tree under control, realizing that that's what it will do. And so as water sprouts and those kind of things start growing, you can get on that and even manage some of that through the summer. And then next year, just deal with that new vegetative growth. And now your tree is down to size. If you don't want to deal with that kind of aggressive growth, you would do something like this and spread it out over the course of a couple of years, only taking a third at a time. And then you wouldn't have quite the vigorous growth. But in this case, this tree is now done. It's down to size.
It still has fruiting spurs. It'll still be productive. You'll still have a little bit of fruit this coming year, but a lot of new growth.
Okay, so with that, with this tree, sorry, the picture of this isn't very good because of the trees behind it. It's kind of hard to see how much of that pear tree was left. There's actually quite a bit left. It's all just much, much lower. We did cut out some of the big branches. Some of those were 4-inch diameter branches, 3-inch diameter branches that came out. But that'll kind of help you maybe get a perspective of what we did with a very large mature tree. That was aggressive. Ideally, you don't need to do that, hopefully. But if you have a tree that's out of control, just knowing what it'll do, knowing with the aggressive growth you're going to produce next year, you can do this. It will invigorate a tree. It'll get a lot of new growth, and then you can start steering and pruning it from there. You could have even, we could have even cut that maybe lower. It would have even been more stubby with less of the remaining fruiting spurs and growth there. But if you understand what it'll do as far as the cutting and stimulation of growth, you can manage any tree. So with that, I had a couple more, but we're out of time. And it's the same stuff, same type of principles, just demonstrating on other trees. With that, I think if you have some questions, let's address them. Let's answer them now. And otherwise, I just appreciate you coming. Appreciate you joining us. This class will be posted, the video, the slides, we'll post them next week, and we'll just kind of go from there. It seems that, anyway, there's a lot of great questions that you've had. I've enjoyed teaching this, and hopefully you've benefited from this. Some of you have mature trees, some of you have new trees. Hopefully this can just really help you manage a tree and get some good fruit off of it. Have a nice looking tree, a fruit producing tree. With the times we live in, I think a lot of people have more and more interest in this stuff because what's happened to the fruit, what's been on it, how it's been handled, and you're producing this in your own yard. So appreciate your time for joining us on a Saturday morning. Just for your information, those trees I pruned, that was about a week and a half ago, right before our weather turned and started snowing on us. I pruned those about a week and a half ago. It's a great time to prune. If you don't mind the cold and you have some trees, start pruning now. You want to wait a couple weeks. The temperatures will probably warm a little bit. But now through March, get out and start pruning your trees. If you have questions, my email address is posted here on the slide, my picture right in front of you, brice@weaverbasin.com. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer those questions. And again, thanks. Any questions, post them. I'll just stay on here for just a couple minutes, and we can just go from there. So as these come in, I'll just answer them live. Let's see, we have some apple and pear trees that are way bigger. Will it hurt them to cut back 1/3? No. If you need to reinvigorate them and bring them down a little bit, or they haven't been pruned in a long time, you can take 1/3 of those out, take 1/3 of the branches at a time, and slowly bring it down. Just kind of have a 3-year plan in mind. If in your mind you have a vision of how you can do this about 1/3 at a time, it's a perfect way to approach it. It's not going to hurt them. Anytime you start cutting, though, you're on an older tree, you're going to stimulate new growth. Just remember that. If you do all of it at once, it'll be tons and tons of growth. 1/3 will minimize that new vigorous, aggressive growth. But certainly get on that and start doing it. It's a great question. You shouldn't have to worry about 1/3. Someone asked, maybe hiring someone else. Yes, you could hire someone else. I don't know if you're applying, hire someone else here or hire someone else to prune your trees. You can hire someone else to prune your trees. If you're afraid of that, you don't think you can get out and attempt to do that, certainly hire somebody to come and prune your trees. It would be better than not pruning your trees. Keep your trees healthy, keep them structurally sound, get good fruit off of them. If you're going to bother with fruit trees, then prune them. If you don't want the fruit, then choose an ornamental. I guess if you don't want fruit at all and it's already there, yeah, you can leave it. It'll just get thick and a little unruly, and you'll just pick up fruit all the time. But certainly, if you want fruit, prune the trees, make them nice, keep them healthy, and you'll have fruit for a lot of years. Will you get frost damage if you prune too early? No, the trees are dormant. You shouldn't have to worry about. Excuse me. Shouldn't have to worry about any frost damage. I mean, it's not going to hurt your trees. If you prune in January, you can prune in January. It's just pruning stimulates growth. So as you start pruning, the tree will start coming alive. It's still cold. I mean, there's a lot of things triggered by daylight and temperature and a lot of things. But as you prune, the tree is recognizing, oh, I've been cut. I need to start growing. I'm going to start stimulating some growth and they'll start getting active. But no, you don't have to worry about any frost damage by pruning too early. Prune now, you're fine. If you live in Canada or something like that, you may wait a little bit because I'm sure you're cold. You're going to be a lot more cold than we are here. You know, this year's weird. Texas right now is freezing compared to us. So every place is a little different. Just watch it and choose a time that's still dormant, but that you're comfortable out in it pruning. That's kind of a good guideline to follow. Another one is I have an apple tree that has been trimmed but not pruned. Is it pretty much vertical and flat without side branches? I'm not sure what to do. Michelle, send me, if you, I'm not sure what to do on that either. Maybe with a picture, I could see some things. Send me an email with a photo. And if you want me to call you and talk to you over the phone, I'm happy to do that. And then maybe we could give you some one-on-one help and talk about your tree specifically with maybe some tips for that. So certainly send me an email with that. We'd be happy to try to help you. It says, when branches are rubbing or crossing each other, how do I know which branch to cut? Choose the branch you want to keep. Just looking at direction, looking at branch size, looking at how, you know, where it's headed. That's how you choose which branch is best to you, and then cut the other one out. That's simply the way. There's not really another rule for that. Is there a recommendation for pruning during harvesting, picking fruit from the pruned branches? Generally don't prune when you're harvesting because pruning stimulates growth. Harvest time is in the fall, typically summer to fall. If you have to do a little bit of pruning in those times, you can prune off a few branches that are dead, diseased, or some problem in the way. And if it has fruit on it, you can pick the fruit from those pruned branches, certainly. But generally speaking, don't prune unless it's dormant. And that's the general rule. Again, just a reminder there. Do you prune 1/3 every year or just as needed? You kind of prune just as needed, except for peaches and nectarines. You can easily take 1/3 to 1/2 of the branches out every single year. They're vigorous. They need a good thinning and pruning. They have a lot of growth. If it's a mature tree, certainly, and you need to bring it down, do 1/3 this year and then watch it. And then if it needs to do another 1/3, but you don't need to take 1/3 of the tree every single year. That's just kind of as an as needed basis. Generally, you won't want to do more than that because it'll stimulate lots of that extra growth. So just kind of watch and balance out how much you need. Some years you may not have to prune them much at all. If it's a different type of year, they don't grow a lot. And as trees mature, it seems like the vigorous growth slows down a little bit. So you don't have to nearly manage great influxes of growth, but each variety is a little different. Some varieties are certainly more vigorous than others, especially dwarf trees and semi-dwarf. They're dwarf because they're not as aggressive and they're not going to get as big naturally. So you won't expect to have all kinds of crazy growth on those. So some years it's just very minor pruning. How do you get the growth? How do you get the growth for the west and east side of the tree? I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. If you have a tree that's just not growing a certain direction, sometimes you can stimulate growth by doing just making a small incision on the trunk of a tree or on a scaffold branch, and sometimes that'll stimulate a little growth. You don't cut it all the way off, you just make a tiny little cut. Sometimes that'll stimulate a bud to form or a little growth out that side of the trunk or that side of a branch, and then you can get some branching growing that direction. If you want to send me a picture or something, we could look at that and maybe help you with that. But if there's simply no branches where you need branches, sometimes that's simply a challenge. You try to train as it grows, and as branches are coming off different parts of the stem, you kind of can allow those to grow into open spaces while you're thinning and keeping other stuff off of other areas. Any suggestions for pruning an espalier tree, apple tree? Yeah, because of that structure, and you're keeping it flat, and you're usually trellising those, the espalier type form. It's the same thing, only you're pruning for direction. So anything that's growing outside of your structure, it's growing too far out, you take that back in. If it's growing too far up, you bring that back down. And most of the time, If it's brand new, you're barely training that, well, then you're tying branches, the lateral branches out on some wires, or you're doing branch spreaders and trying to get it going that way. But anything that comes out of that, you kind of take it back down using thinning cuts back down to the joints. And eventually you get a very nice structured espalier tree. They're a little harder to deal with. They're a little more intensive pruning and very specific because you're shaping them in a very specific way. But it can be done, and people do it all the time, and they look awesome, especially if you don't have a lot of room, you're trying to train that along a fence or something. That's a great question. I hope that helped. I have a 20-foot tall apricot tree. It took some heavy damage in the last windstorm. I've liked the shade it provides, and also the fruit. It is very overwhelming looking at it and thinking about pruning it. Yes, and apricot trees live a very long time as well. So if you don't want to deal with it, but it's got some damage, you may consider hiring somebody to maybe help you get it taken care of. They get big like that. I've got a very old apricot tree. I think the thing's got to be 60 years old, and it's tall. And I've got up on a ladder and cut, try to get it down to size. But they can be very vigorous too. And if it's got some wind damage, it is overwhelming. There's a lot to deal with there. They're big, they're structural, they're hard to deal with. You maybe just hire it if you can't get to doing it yourself. Have somebody come and do it for you. It'll cost you a little bit, but maybe it's worth it instead of getting up in a ladder and cutting out dead branches and trying to deal with that. You can be fairly vigorous with apricots. I've taken an apricot tree, my old one, down quite a bit to take out some big branches, but then it had new growth in the top, and so I'm just managing that new growth, but still very productive. I hope that helped. And then it says, what is the rule of thumb for thinning out pears? Same thing as apples. If they'll form in little clusters, you got some apples or pears together. It's just I would say too, if you just see solitary pears, it's kind of the same rule with the peaches. You're spreading them out maybe about a distance, a minimum of a fist. So from this side of your fist to the other, 4 to 5 inches apart if they're that heavy. But that's the general rule, about the same as apples. Pears do form a little differently. But I hope that helps. Spread them out this far, or a fist width, 4 inches apart is a minimum. They're not going to be touching. You'll have maybe a few less issues with the worms and pears and different problems. And I hope that helped you. What credentials should I look for when hiring someone to prune trees? Ask them about experience, for one thing. Not everybody's going to know how to prune, even if they claim they know how to prune. Maybe ask for some previous work that you could call for some references. Cities sometimes have a list, whatever city you're in, they sometimes have a certified arborist. You could call a city and ask about their arborist, and then the arborist may know, as well as your state extension, your county extension offices. Sometimes they have people that they know, that they're good pruners, they've been trained, they know what they're doing. They're just not maybe in a phone book. They don't necessarily run a business, but they would do some of this kind of work. I would just ask around, call some of those reputable extension type offices and city offices, and ask city arborists and other extension people about, people that know how to prune and they've just been trained. They may not run a business, but they do it as a little bit of side work. I have a new peach tree, about 1 year old, with a double main trunk. We watched it last year. Peaches on one trunk, smaller and sweeter on the other, large and bland. Which one goes, or do I leave them both? It's a personal preference. It's a good question. Something happened when that tree was young, and it could have been grafted originally, and then something happened off of the graft. It formed a new thing. That's why you may have two different tasting peaches, is because one came from the original rootstock and one came from the grafted in branch. If you want to, choose which one you love the best. You could leave them both and prune and shape, and you'd have two parallel trunks, and maybe not ideal, but it's not terrible either. It's just, it's your tree. You could leave them both if you wish, or if you just don't love one, cut it down at the trunk, cut it down at the base, leave the other one and start shaping that one. it may have had smaller and sweeter peaches just because there were too many of them that year. And as the tree grows and matures out, you may end up with a very nice, sweeter peach for that one. I think if it were me, if one of them was large but just a terrible tasting peach, I wouldn't bother with it. I wouldn't waste my time trying to keep that alive. I would cut that trunk completely off and just deal with the other. But that is a personal preference, completely up to you. So I hope that helps you. Seems like we've made it through all the questions. I noticed there's somebody keeps pushing the raise the hand button. It's hard to address those because we can't really unmute and do things that way. So if you've raised your hand and you have a question, just type it in the Q&A box and we'll address that. I appreciate it again, your time, your participation here. And please join us again for another class. I'll hang tight here for just another 30 seconds if there's any other questions. And if not, enjoy your Saturday. If you're here locally, the sun's out, at least we're Layton where I am, the sun is out. I don't know how warm it's going to get today. It might snow. It might snow today. But today might be a great day for you to get out and do a little pruning if it warms up above, if it's tolerable for you. Get out and do it. And appreciate all the comments, the thank yous and all that kind of stuff. And I'll look forward to seeing you again on the next one. So everyone have a great day. Looks like that's all the questions. So I'm going to end the webinar now and we'll see you again at the next one. Thanks again. Have a good day.